Imagine absolute power, with no checks, no balances, and a mind that slowly unravels into pure depravity. What happens when the most powerful man in the world believes he's a god, a monster, or both? This is not just the story of emperors and palaces, it is the story of madness elevated to law, cruelty disguised as authority, and ordinary human lives crushed under the weight of unchecked ambition. Today, we step into ancient Rome, not to marvel at its greatness, but to descend into its darkest corridors, where emperors ruled with blood-stained hands and fragile, fractured minds. The Roman Empire at its height was an unstoppable machine. Its legions marched across continents. Its cities flourished with art, philosophy, and trade. Yet beneath the marble arches and golden domes, the empire's heart often beat to the rhythm of fear. For emperors were not merely rulers. They were seen as living gods, their whims shaping the lives of millions. And when those gods lost their grip on reason, the result was chaos, terror, and destruction that left scars not just on history but on humanity itself. Consider Caligula, whose very name has become synonymous with madness. Born as Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, he was once a beloved child, nicknamed Little Boots, by the soldiers who adored his father. At first, the people of Rome welcomed him as a savior after the suffocating rule of Tiberius. He began his reign with generosity, granting bonuses to soldiers and gifts to citizens. For a moment, Rome believed in him. But what happens when kindness is merely a mask, a fragile veneer hiding the unraveling of a mind touched by darkness? Caligula's descent was swift. He began to see himself not as a man, not even as an emperor, but as a god in flesh. He declared that his own statue be placed in temples alongside Jupiter and demanded worship as though he were divine. But madness does not stop at arrogance, it feeds on cruelty. Caligula began ordering executions not for justice, but for entertainment. Men and women were slaughtered in arenas on a whim, and senators lived in constant terror, knowing that a glance, a word, or even silence could mean death. There are whispers in history, perhaps exaggerated, perhaps not, that he once declared war on the sea itself, ordering his soldiers to march into the waves and collect seashells as spoils of victory. Was this insanity, or a calculated humiliation to remind his legions that their loyalty was not to Rome, but to his unchallenged power? What do you call a ruler who can command thousands into absurdity and still be obeyed? Is it madness, or is it tyranny perfected? But Caligula's cruelty reached its darkest point, not in politics, but in the human soul. He delighted in mocking the weak, the enslaved, the powerless. In Rome, millions lived in bondage, stripped of identity and dignity, and for Caligula, their suffering was theater. The empire's foundation was already built upon the exploitation of human lives. Yet under him, even their pain was weaponized for spectacle. Think of the mother who watched her son thrown two beasts for the emperor's amusement. The man forced to kill another just to survive another day. The child whose life was snuffed out before it had even begun. Their voices are not recorded in marble, but their cries echo in the shadows of history. And then there was Nero. If Caligula embodied cruelty, Nero represented self-indulgence gone rabid. He fancied himself an artist, a poet, a singer. But imagine an emperor whose vanity was so fragile that he forced senators and nobles to sit through his endless performances, not daring to yawn, not daring to leave, while Rome itself crumbled outside. Nero inherited a city that was the jewel of the ancient world, and yet he is remembered not for building it, but for burning it. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE consumed vast districts of the city, leaving thousands homeless and desperate. Some sources claim Nero played music as flames devoured lives and homes, though perhaps the detail was crafted by his enemies. What is undeniable is his response. Instead of shouldering responsibility, Nero found a scapegoat. He turned his fury toward a small, marginalized group, the Christians. They were already distrusted, already marked as outsiders, already despised for rejecting Rome's gods. Nero seized this prejudice and twisted it into policy. Christians were arrested, tortured, and executed in the most brutal of ways. Some were covered in pitch and set ablaze as human torches to light Nero's gardens. Others were torn apart by wild beasts for public amusement. Here was Rome's ultimate theater, cruelty dressed as justice. The emperor's paranoia, satisfied by the agony of the vulnerable. In this story, we must pause, because the persecution of Christians in Nero's Rome is not just about religion. It is about power and the machinery of discrimination. It is the eternal cycle of blaming the powerless for the failures of the powerful. It is the age-old tactic of empire. When your throne trembles, find someone weaker, and crush them under its weight. Rome's grandeur did not protect its oppressed. In fact, it was built upon their suffering. And in Nero's reign, their suffering was turned into firelight, illuminating the emperor's cruelty for all to see. But what makes these emperors truly terrifying is not just their madness. It is the silence that surrounded them. Senators bowed. Generals saluted, citizens whispered in fear, slaves had no voice to raise. When power becomes absolute, the truth dies, and when the truth dies, cruelty thrives unchecked. Think of the enslaved man who knew his master's cruelty was fueled by the emperor's example. Think of the mother who knew her child's fate could be decided by a ruler's whim. Their pain did not make it into the history books, but it lived in the veins of Rome, poisoning its soul. Rome celebrated its victories in marble and steel, but beneath that glittering facade, there were broken bodies, silenced voices, and forgotten lives. When we speak of Caligula and Nero, we are not merely speaking of eccentric rulers. We are speaking of the human cost of unchecked power. We are speaking of the dangers that unfold when a society worships authority more than it protects justice. We are speaking of how easily the powerful can turn their insecurities into weapons against the weak. And so, the question remains, what do we learn from these emperors? That madness and power is dangerous. Yes, but even more dangerous is the world that allows such madness to reign. Caligula and Nero were not gods, though they claimed to be. They were men, fragile and broken, who built their empires on fear. But it was not their madness alone that destroyed lives, it was the obedience of those who followed, the silence of those who dared not resist, and the forgotten cries of the powerless who paid the highest price. This is only the beginning of Rome's darkest tale. For beyond Caligula and Nero lay others whose hands were equally stained, whose names echo with terror. Domitian, Commodus, Caracalla emperors, whose reigns remind us again and again that when humanity surrenders to tyranny, the result is not glory, but ruin. In their shadows, we find not only the collapse of an empire, but the collapse of human dignity itself. And as we continue, we will dive deeper into the paranoia, the betrayals, the assassinations, and the rivers of blood that marked Rome's descent into chaos. The empire may have stretched across the world, but its greatest battles were often fought in the chambers of its own rulers' minds. Domitian, to some Romans, his reign began with hope. He promised order after the chaos of civil war, stability after the storms of weak rulers. And indeed, for a time, he restored Rome's finances, strengthened the legions, and enforced discipline. But absolute power does not always corrupt immediately, corrodes slowly, like iron left in the rain. Domitian's need for control grew into paranoia. He filled the city with spies, turning neighbors into informants, friends into traitors. At any moment, a whispered word could mean your death. Senators lived like prisoners in their own villas, afraid to speak, afraid to breathe too loudly. Domitian loved to be called Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. He demanded worship not as a man, but as a deity. Yet his godhood was fragile, born of fear rather than reverence. He ordered executions on suspicion alone, often without trial. People vanished into the shadows of Rome's prisons, their names erased, their memory damned. Imagine a father accused falsely, dragged away from his children in the night, never to return. Imagine a mother pleading with soldiers, her cries unanswered. As the emperor's paranoia swallowed another innocent life. These stories are not carved into marble, but they were carved into the hearts of Rome's people. And then came Commodus, a name that still drips with infamy. Son of Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king who embodied Rome's nobler ideals. Commodus was the living proof that greatness is not always inherited. If Marcus Aurelius stood for wisdom, Commodus stood for indulgence. He abandoned governance to indulge in vanity and violence. Commodus styled himself as the reincarnation of Hercules, dressing in lion skins, carrying a club, demanding that the empire see him not as a man, but as a demigod reborn. But it was not enough to pose as Hercules. He sought to prove it in blood. Commodus entered the gladiatorial arena, not as a spectator, but as a performer. The emperor of Rome, the man who commanded the legions of the world, stood in the sand with sword in hand. But it was not courage, it was theater. His opponents were often wounded or tied, forced into hopeless battles, ensuring Commodus would always win. He killed hundreds in the arena, reveling in the cheers of a crowd that dared not boo. Yet beneath the spectacle lay tragedy. For every staged victory, real men were forced to die, their dignity stripped, their blood spilled for the emperor's vanity. What does it say about an empire when its ruler treats human life as little more than entertainment? The enslaved, the powerless, the marginalized, they were the foundation of Rome's games. Their screams filled the Colosseum while Commodus basked in applause. In their deaths, Rome revealed its darkest truth. That an empire so celebrated for its culture and order was equally a machine of cruelty and spectacle. And then, perhaps most chilling of all, was Caracalla. His reign began with blood, for he murdered his own brother Geta to seize the throne. Imagine the palace halls where two brothers once played as children, now stained with the blood of fratricide. Caracalla did not hide his crime. He pursued it further, ordering the massacre of Geta's supporters. Tens of thousands were slaughtered in a purge so vast that the city of Rome itself seemed to bleed. Mothers wept for sons slain in the streets. Wives mourned husbands taken by the sword. Children were left orphaned, all to satisfy one man's hunger for power. Caracalla's cruelty was not random. It was systemic. He raised taxes to unbearable heights, squeezing the provinces until they starved. He extended Roman citizenship not as an act of generosity, but as a means to extract more taxes from conquered peoples. And when the people of Alexandria mocked him, he responded with brutality that defies comprehension. He invited the city's leading citizens to a feast, then slaughtered them as they dined. His soldiers rampaged through the streets, cutting down thousands, turning a city of culture and learning into a river of corpses. Alexandria's libraries may have survived, but its people did not. What unites Caligula, Nero, Domitian, Commodus, and Caracalla is not simply madness or vanity. It is the pattern of power twisted into tyranny, humanity reduced to theater, justice sacrificed to fear. Each in their own way turned the machinery of empire against its people, some against the elite, some against the poor, some against the enslaved and marginalized, but always against humanity itself. Their reigns remind us of a truth that history whispers across ages: unchecked power, in the hands of the unstable, is the deadliest poison a society can drink. Yet even in these shadows, there is something more to see. For every emperor who ruled with madness, there were countless nameless souls who endured, who resisted in quiet ways. The slave who whispered forbidden prayers, the Christian who faced the beasts in the arena and sang hymns to the end, the mother who told her children stories of justice and dignity, even when emperors mocked such ideals. These are the stories less told, yet they are the heartbeat of history. Rome's emperors may have carved their names into stone, but it was the oppressed who carved their courage into eternity. So what do we make of Rome's darkest emperors? Were they merely madmen, cursed by the gods, broken by the weight of the purple robe, or were they mirrors, reflecting the dangers of a system that allowed one man to hold the lives of millions in his grasp? Perhaps it is both. Caligula's laughter as men died, Nero's firelit gardens, Commodus's staged battles, Caracalla's massacres. These are not just tales of individuals, they are warnings of what happens when humanity surrenders to power without conscience. The story of ancient Rome is often told as one of greatness: roads, aqueducts, law, architecture. But the story of its emperors reminds us that greatness without justice is a mask, and behind that mask is cruelty. Rome fell not only because of barbarians at its gates, but because of the rot within. Emperors like these hollowed out the empire's soul long before its walls crumbled. And in remembering them, we must also remember those who suffered under them, the enslaved who built their palaces, the soldiers who fought their pointless wars, the families who mourned their endless purges. History is not only the tale of emperors, it is the echo of the oppressed, the silenced, the forgotten. Their dignity, even in death, outshines the marble statues of tyrants. So, imagine again, absolute power, with no checks, no balances, and a mind unraveling into depravity. What happens when the most powerful man in the world believes he is a god, a monster, or both? Ancient Rome has already answered, and if we listen closely, the lesson is not just about the past. It is about every age, every nation, every society that forgets that power must be bound to justice, and that dignity belongs not only to the powerful, but to every human being. For Rome's darkest emperors are gone, their palaces in ruins, their statues broken. But the dangers they embodied, the madness, the mayhem, the the cruelty born of unchecked power, those dangers remain. And it is up to us, in our time, to remember their lessons, to honor the forgotten, and to ensure that never again does madness wear the crown of humanity's destiny.